Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. For the last panel of the day, we are super looking forward to it. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction of all of our panelists here. And so when I say your name, just give a little wave. Oh, did you guys notice I have a cast on? Anyway, so yes, it coordinates so well with my black outfit, doesn't it? Just so everybody knows who you are. So first we have Louise Mistral, who is the Executive Director of the Sky Island Alliance, a conservation organization based in Tucson, Arizona, dedicated to conserving the diversity of life and lands in the Sky Island region of the US and Mexico. Louise has led local collaborative climate change adaptation planning processes and worked with hundreds of partners and volunteers to implement adaptation projects to the ground. Welcome, Louise. And then we have Emily Elias, who is the director of the USDA Southwest Climate Hub. This is one of the 10 hubs across the United States working to build climate resilience on agricultural and forested lands. She has worked for more than 2 decades at the interface of water scarcity, quality, agricultural production, and natural resources with the goal of supporting resilient landscapes and communities. And we have Cynthia Naha, who currently serves as the director of the Natural Resources Department for the Santo Domingo Pueblo and is an enrolled member of the Hopi tribe and is also Tewa and Ihanktawan Dakota Oyate. Ms. Naha has worked in various fields, including but not limited to solid waste, recycling, brownfields, emergency response, preparedness, water quality, climate change, unexploded ordinances, and more, and has worked with several tribes in Arizona and Northern California, and now New Mexico. Cynthia is a graduate of the Arizona State University with a Bachelor's of Arts in American Indian Studies. We have Sherry Ryan, is the director of the School of Public Affairs and a member of their city planning faculty. She teaches long-range land use and transportation planning for the school's Master of City Planning degree program. She has also worked in the San Diego region for over 20 years as a transportation planner and practitioner, mainly for local agency long-range bicycle and pedestrian plans. She is passionate about increasing non-motorized access and reducing the need to drive and subsequent negative impacts. She is a research partner on the Connecting Wildlands and Communities project at SDSU. And last, we have Phoebe Swina, is the founder and owner of High Watermark LCC, which works with tribes and pueblos on a variety of issues and initiatives from environmental policy, land acquisition, planning, infrastructure, and how governmental policies, laws, and priorities affect tribal communities. Ms. Swina works with Native communities and local municipalities to address climate adaptation, environmental, natural geohazards, and water resource issues by utilizing a consensus-based approach that incorporates traditional and local knowledge. Her traditional Pueblo background is complemented by formal training in environmental engineering, project management, and a master's degree from Dartmouth College. With this background of tradition plus science, a phrase I really like, for the last 19 years, Ms. Swina has helped Pueblo and local communities manage projects in flood mitigation, environmental restoration, regulatory compliance, erosion control, hazard mitigation, and all other environmental related projects. Ms. Swina is active in Pueblo cultural activities and is rooted in her Pueblo communities at Cochiti Pueblo and San Felipe Pueblo. And lastly, I am Tamara Wall. I am the Deputy Director of the Western Regional Climate Center, located at the Desert Research Institute in Reno, Nevada. So we have a hugely talented and experienced group of panelists today. And just as a reminder, if you would like to put questions to the panelists, please go to the posting board, which is at the top of the SWAF interface, and click on Engage, and then you will find the board for this panel, Practical Applications, under day 1. So just to thank my panelists, we've talked a little bit about these questions, and I'm going to throw them out to you. I think I'll start with, I'm actually not going to dictate who speaks. So I'm just going to throw this out there, and whoever feels that the question really kind of speaks to them, you have at it, okay? So a lot of the things that we've been discussing today have been big challenges, right? This project is attempting to address some really big challenges that don't fit neatly into one particular discipline or one particular area of expertise or one part of society. And I think from your backgrounds, and you guys are all people who work in that space, right? You build a lot of bridges, you cross a lot of boundaries. And so you see these challenges from multiple perspectives every day. And so thinking about the adaptation challenges you and your community are facing, how do those challenges show up in your daily work? What do those look like on a daily level sometimes, both big and small?
So I guess I'll go ahead and take a stab at it. Well, good afternoon, everybody. As mentioned, I work for the Santo Domingo Pueblo, which is located here in central New Mexico. It's like south of Santa Fe by 35 miles, north of Albuquerque by 25. And so the way I look at it, a lot of times the challenges I face, I think, is just communicating what climate change is and really trying to make those connections and that correlation to what we see happening in our communities as far as, the landscape is concerned, as far as perhaps our infrastructure is concerned in regards to, different climatic events like the monsoonal rains that can oftentimes wreak havoc on, our buildings and other infrastructures, including our watersheds. So I think oftentimes challenges is just, that in itself is really understanding the information that we as technical staff have to understand in order to not only to develop these adaptation strategies to become a more resilient community, but also having to make the connection and, so to speak, translate the scientific data and information into a way in which our leadership and our community members can understand. The community that I work for, they are primarily Kara speaking, so they're traditionally speaking. And I, as a Hopi woman, I don't know Kara. I know my coworkers and my staff would tell you one of these days she's gonna learn, and she's gonna know what we're saying. But I'm very thankful for them because they're able to, when we talk about it from that scientific perspective, and for the lack of a better word, downscaling it into, say, a Pueblo model of adaptation for our resiliency, then that's where it's imperative to be able to have the connections with their communities. And I know oftentimes it is challenging really to just do that. How do you translate these projections that are showing, mid to end of century, temperatures, precipitation, lack of precipitation, and how do you really explain that? And do you really explain it, especially when you look at it from a traditional perspective of maybe oftentimes that those types of discussions are taboo. So, I know for the work that I do, as the director of Santo Domingo Pueblo, as well as overseeing the ad hoc committee, New Mexico Tribal Resiliency Action Network, is really just that. How do we overcome some of these simple challenges, such as communicating? And I know there's even bigger challenges out there that I know we face when it comes to climate adaptation. But I know for me, as I started in this, I guess, work or being more involved in climate adaptation, I noticed, when it comes to having that connection, not just to our community, but to our natural world, as Indigenous Native Pueblo people, that I think it's imperative that we speak in that context of respect to what we're trying to enable and implement as far as these actions and strategies, and making sure that as we're looking at our ability to mitigate against climate change, that we're also looking at ways of reciprocity and to help heal our Mother Earth and to give back. Thank you.
Thank you, Symphony. Phoebe?
Thank you. My name is Phoebe. Many blessings to everybody. I just wanted to add to what Ms. Naha was talking about in terms of communication and working with the communities, as well as leadership and decision makers. And apologize, I didn't add this into my bio, but I wear a couple of different hats here in New Mexico. And one of them is I'm the chair of the New Mexico Environmental Improvement Board, which oversees all the rules and regulations for the state of New Mexico. And then I also wear the hat of the chair of the Natural Resources Committee for the All Pueblo Council of Governors. So one of the challenges that I see, as well as my professional work, working with tribal leadership and the community members, what I see in the work that I do is this communication, and it's having, as Cynthia was saying, is having to translate into different arenas to different audiences at different times, and then also really knowing who you're speaking with. So like in some way, in some arenas, like at Cynthia's Pueblo, where she works, tribal council, speaking in Keres, and literally that's a translation into some technical aspects and then translating it into Keres so that those that speak and those decision makers that understand Keres and understand some of the traditional perspectives can grasp what the technical aspects of a particular situation or issue come about. But yet then when I sit on the Environmental Improvement Board, it's very technical, but it's also a policy board and talking about rules and regulations and compliance. So you have to speak in that language, as well as, you know, talking with the tribal leaders, all the 20 governors, Pueblo governors, is you only get a little bit of time with them because they're so busy. And so you have to make sure that you've done your homework and you message correctly so that you can grasp their attention and the priorities. So a lot of what I see in my work is having to be able to translate and communicate, but as well as understand the listener in a particular situation or arena that a meeting or forum that a meeting is being held, so that you can sort of move the needle. One other aspect that I do find kind of very challenging is even within the current rule, regulation, and policy framework, I find it very difficult with those rules and regulations that are in black and white, having to operate within those rules and regulations and what's written in black and white, when some of the things that we need to take into consideration with climate adaptation or how to make our landscapes and our resources resilient don't nicely fit within the black and white rules and regulations that we currently have, whether in the state of New Mexico or in local governments or in the federal government policies. And so that's another challenge that I see in my daily work. Thank you.
Thanks. Louise, Emily, or Sherry? How about Emily? And then we'll go to Louise and then Sherry.
Okay, great. Yeah, I work at a different scale. And so as I was listening to the other panelists, it made me think, wow, that can be a big challenge. So the Climate Hub covers 4 states in the Southwest, plus Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific Islands. So just talking about those 4 states, thinking about translating science and supporting adaptation where it happens, right? So adaptation doesn't happen at the state level. Adaptation happens with small groups of people who are really interested in coping with a specific issue. And so I think that issue of scale is a really important one, to realize that to do this well, we need to support people where they are and to support groups of people that are wanting to work together around a challenge or issue. So that is one of my big challenges, the challenge of scale, spatial, but also temporal, right? Some of the actions that we need to take now don't necessarily translate well into what we know about the future from climate models. So that's a big challenge, spatial and temporal scale. Another challenge relates to resources. So we go through a big planning process with a group of interested people, and then we need to fund that adaptation. And so the challenge is linking, in my case, NRCS or rural development or other funding agencies to actually apply or implement those adaptation practices. And then the third piece is hope, is climate hope. So we're dealing with a lot of climate change we're already experiencing, and then looking to the future, looking at some bleak scenarios. And so remembering or tapping into or maintaining climate hope, and the idea that as we work together, we can do a lot of amazing things, is something that we run into. And I think at the same time, acknowledging that this is hard work, right? That it's hard, that we're in this together, and that it can be tiring. And then getting to our space of climate hope. So those are the three things that I'm thinking about in terms of challenge and adaptation.
Thanks, Emily. Louise?
Yeah, what's been said already really resonates with me. So I'm working in southern Arizona and northern Mexico in the Sky Islands, which are these isolated mountains, forested mountains surrounded by desert and grassland. And it's a real mix of different jurisdictions, federal land management agencies, state, private land in the US. And the communication piece that's already been brought up is a big part of what my organization is doing. We are not managing land or resources, so we're playing this role of working with the agencies that are to try and infuse thinking about climate change impacts into their planning and management choices, and influence them to include adaptation in their projects. And so that piece of really showing how adapting to climate change can be integrated into what they're already doing, and helping them understand how taking steps now, as was mentioned, that might not seem relevant longer term, can help us move along a path toward a better long-term outcome. I also, what Emily said about climate hope, I was sitting here thinking, one of the challenges we don't talk a lot about necessarily as scientists and practitioners that I've really been feeling a lot with in myself and with my team the last couple of years is just grief over what we're losing in these places that we're working. Arizona's in a terrible, terrible drought situation, and places we've been working with partners to protect and that we love, spring ecosystems, streams are drying up, and we're losing some really precious places on the land. So that's been a real challenge the last year or so, is dealing with that and finding a way to soldier on. We're fortunate to work with a lot of volunteers and actually do on the ground small scale projects that are nested within this larger landscape planning. So that is certainly cause for hope, and feels good to get hands dirty and do the little pieces of work we can on the landscape.
Yeah. Thanks, Louise. Sherry?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I could talk about this topic from a couple different perspectives, but I guess I'll share first, my experience working as a researcher on the CWC, and some of the themes that have been raised is the challenge of doing interdisciplinary work around this. I mean, the climate action, climate change really is so amazingly broad and touches everyone. But as researchers and scientists, we spend a lot of time specializing and becoming very specialized in the work we do. So when we have a lot of specialized people sitting around a table, it's hard to get them to loosen up their heart and, make themselves vulnerable and say, I don't understand what you're talking about to the other person. And I've experienced that in the CWC, is that, we have biologists, we have civil engineers, we have geographers, and we all speak different languages. And, perhaps my background as planner is broader. So we're, you know, and so we need to be connecting these disciplines, these specialized thinkers. And that's really challenging. It makes me think also a lot about education and the value of urban planning, city planning, which is incredibly broad. And the need for generalists who aren't afraid to say, I don't understand what you're talking about. Could you say that in simpler terms, a different way? And because if that doesn't happen early on, and you know, in dealing with these complex problems, we lose people as we try to move the conversations forward. We just lose, you know, people fall off, they tune out. So as we, you know, deal with something as complicated and broad reaching as climate adaptation or climate change or threats, you know, that we're speaking in simplistic language, that we have people in place who can act as connectors, who can read the audiences and know when people are getting lost and pull them back in. So I think that's very important. And that's kind of from my work doing interdisciplinary work and feeling lost all the time when I'm talking to public health researchers, biologists. You know, you have to have the nerve at some point to just say, I'm lost, what are you talking about? And so that's a small example. But in my work as a mobility planner, you know, which is very much in the urban context, and I think a lot of our conversation is more focused on the natural context, but urban planners who are trying to think about how cities grow are, you know, they're really hitting their heads against the wall, talking to community members about the fact that we need to grow inside in already urbanized areas and leave the undeveloped areas alone. And, you know, we have this battle ongoingly. We need to densify in already urbanized areas. And we need to stop driving the way we drive, because transportation is 50–60% of emissions. That's, you know, that's pointing to this problem that we're experiencing. So those two things, you know, city planners in the urban context are really hitting their head against the wall, talking about this and trying to get cities to make these changes. It meets with incredible resistance from community members. They want their single family house. They don't want multifamily housing in their community if it's already single family, and they want to be able to drive everywhere they go. And so it's very difficult. And I'll just leave it at there in terms of my challenges.
Thanks, Sherry. I just, you know, what I'm hearing are a lot of similar words in the, you know, the concepts that really stand out, which is communication, connections. Translation was a really big one. There's a lot of the need for translation, and along with that language, respect, reciprocity, hope, and loss. And as one person put it in the chat, was grief that we're all kind of feeling about the loss of some of these landscapes. So the theme of this panel was focused on challenges, but also the importance of working on these challenges in integrated or interdisciplinary teams. And I spent, I think, a good 5 or 6 years at DRI, being the only social scientist with about 165 physical scientists. So I used to refer to myself as a cohort of one. Eventually I hired a second social scientist. So I always like to say that I doubled our social science capacity at DRI. So I spent a lot of time on those kind of teams, and believe really passionately that the way to address climate change and adaptation, equity, climate justice is through these interdisciplinary teams, which are just shockingly hard to do. Just shocking. It's hard to get the funding for them. There's so many structural barriers. The list goes on. And then when you get a team together, then the challenges there's a whole new host of challenges that go with this. And as we were talking about earlier, it's vocabulary. It's learning a shared vocabulary across expertise. As Cynthia pointed out, that sometimes it's a whole language. as well as, an expertise-based language. But everybody on this panel is a bridge builder, and you guys have all been there and you've done this work. And I was wondering if anybody would like to share a reflection on a time, because this work is really hard, and it would be easier to go back into our own silos and just work with all of our buddies, right? All of our peeps. And sometimes it feels a little overwhelming. But thinking about doing this kind of work where you've been on, working on a problem or a project, or to address a problem that required a lot of different people to come together. Where was it? Is there a time that really stands out for you where having that integrated team, having that diversity of perspectives really made the difference? So, and Sherry, if you're comfortable, since you went last, the first question, I'll put it back to you, because that's always my gift to the person who goes last. But if you want some more time to think, that's cool too.
Well, I guess, in the previous question, we were responding to what are the difficulties, and you're now asking what are the wonderful things about working in interdisciplinary groups. And I guess I would lean on my experience, and I can provide an example from the mobility kind of public health realm. About 15 years ago, public health researchers became very interested in community environments, in the shape of communities. Transportation researchers, mobility researchers, and practitioners had been trying to, move the way we travel in cities, more transit, more walking, more cycling. And our whole profession became reinvigorated. Large surge of funding, including large surges of funding, became reinvigorated when the public health professionals, practitioners, researchers got interested in how the shape of our communities affects health. Mm-hmm. And so this was an amazing development. I think our field of mobility planning and city planning, active transportation planning, grew by leaps and bounds in the space of 10 years, just because of the collaboration with public health professionals. They were able to shine a light on the work that transportation practitioners had been doing in a way that we couldn't shine on ourselves. And so it made a significant change in the quantity of work that was getting done, the legislative initiatives that were rising up around active transportation and travel, and the general awareness that the way we're living is unhealthy for us. It's creating an obesity epidemic. It's creating all kinds of preventable diseases. It all boils down to how our land uses are put together and how we travel through space. And so collaboration in that sense was so helpful for planning, to have public health practitioners. So, and that's not such an example related to the topics of climate adaptation, but I think it's a really interesting one, that there may be a profession out there that can shine a light on this work and just cause a groundswell change in importance, in focus, and maybe we need to keep thinking what that might be for climate adaptation.
Thanks. That's a great point. Emily?
Yeah, I have some stories, actually, stories about what you were asking about in terms of teams and interdisciplinary folks coming together. And one is in response to the 2018 exceptional drought over the Colorado Plateau. And of course, during that drought, we were seeing the impacts we often see with, dead livestock and horses, water, municipalities almost running out of water, the many impacts we see. And a group of climate service providers came together and realized that really what needed to happen was more of a peer-to-peer network. And so from that really challenging time came the Drought Learning Network, where peers are learning from other peers about what was successful in responding to and planning for drought in the future. And so that network exists now. So now we're again in those severe drought conditions. And it's really helpful to have some of those stories and case studies and a network of now 66 people that are working together to try to respond as opposed to working in isolation. And I think that's really what needs to happen more as we move forward, is understanding what resources other people have and leveraging those and working as a community on some of these huge challenges. And so that's one example or one story where a lot of different groups of people came together, some interested in wildlife, some interested in natural stream flows, some interested in just climate science in general, a lot of resource managers and farmers and ranchers. So I think that's a good example of people trying to move forward and learning from others, learning from their peers and their other communities. And I'll stop there because I want everybody to have a chance, but I have a few other stories if we have time later.
All right, that was a great example. My other panelists?
I'll go ahead. Oh,
yeah.
I was going to turn it over to Phoebe if I saw you. And so I guess kind of hitting off of everybody else's points. I know for me, and working in the Pueblo and, working with other tribal nations in Arizona and California, it's really imperative to really be able to have interdisciplinary work as well as collaboration, because I know I can't do this work myself. And for me, I also wear many hats, whether it's dealing with forestry work, agricultural work, water rights, water quality, solid waste, recycling, even looking at wildlife connectivity and corridors. But really, I think for me, when it comes to looking at this interdisciplinary work, it's also looking at it from a holistic perspective, because I know for me, being in my position and being a 100% federally funded program or department, it is imperative that I have working relationships to leverage resources. Here in the state of New Mexico, they're talking about shared stewardship with the forestry, department for the state and of course the federal agency. But really, how does shared stewardship look like when it comes to reservation boundaries, in which our work limits us to that boundary, and how do we really implement these concepts of shared stewardship? And even looking at the New Mexico Tribal Resiliency Action Network, those are my peeps, man. I give them lots of love, because without my colleagues that are really dedicated to being able to communicate climate change to our Pueblo and tribal communities here in New Mexico, it's very imperative to be able to have that multidisciplinary perspective, because if we don't, then we're really doing a disservice to our tribal communities. Because just like the city of Santa Fe exists, or San Diego, that's how we operate in our tribal and Pueblo communities, is that we're always there trying to provide services similar to those capacities. So again, by being able to bridge those gaps, or to have inclusivity across the board when it comes to looking at our climate resiliency and those adaptation strategies that we're hoping to implement once federal funding comes around, then, again, being able to work in those capacities, I think is just rewarding in itself, because I often and always thank my colleagues for just their time, their energy, their resources, their input, because without that, I don't even think I'd be able to be the climate champion I am today, let alone being able to put forth, workshops and other opportunities for our community members to learn from and also engage. Thank you.
Yeah, we stand on a lot of other shoulders, don't we, to do this work? Yeah. So Phoebe, and then we'll go to Louise.
All right, thank you so much. I'll just try to be direct, and so we can give others time. So one of the examples I have was at Cochiti Pueblo in 2011, we had the Las Conchas fire, which is at the time was the biggest state fire footprint. But with the Las Conchas fire, it was also a very severe fire that spanned over the landscape, moving the first 18 hours an acre a second. So it really just devastated the landscape. And so Cochiti was at the bottom of the watershed of 3 major watersheds that were impacted by the fire. The biggest one being a 47 square mile watershed called Peralta. And so after the fire, I had done some work at Los Alamos National Laboratory after the Cerro Grande fire and mitigating the flooding within the Los Alamos National Laboratory landscape and facilities. So when I came to Cochiti, there was like literally no money, up at the lab. I had millions of dollars to mitigate flooding and post-fire restoration. At Cochiti, there was literally nothing, no resources. So I'm sitting there scratching my head, how are we gonna protect the people? Because the Pueblo was actually at the bottom of the funnel. Like if we think of the watershed as a funnel, Cochiti was literally like one of the last dots before it enters into the mainstream or main river of the middle of the Rio Grande River. So what happened though was working on that effort was a success, because in 2013 we had post-wildfire flooding a magnitude or 2 magnitude greater than what we would have had had there been no fire within that particular watershed. In one of the adjacent watersheds, it was almost 1,000 times greater. It was just immense flooding. But because of an interdisciplinary and even an intergovernmental, multi-governmental, multi-level of government collaboration, we were actually able to protect and do flood mitigation that was, I guess, that respected the cultural landscape within the Cochiti Pueblo, as well as the ancestral cultural domain of Cochiti, working across U.S. Forest Service jurisdiction, Bureau of Land Management jurisdiction, state land office jurisdiction, private landowner jurisdictions, and then Cochiti Pueblo's jurisdiction. And so when we had major rain events in September of 2013, when basically the entire state of New Mexico was flooding, we had about 9,000 cubic feet coming down toward Cochiti, the main village. But what we had done is, with the help of the Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, guidance from our traditional leadership, and in the monsoon seasons, if you don't know anything about Pueblos, we have our annual feasts and we have other dances when we actually pray for rain. So we're praying for rain. And I remember going to the traditional leader after the fire saying, okay, we're praying for rain, but if rain comes, we're gonna have to get out of the way, because we're gonna have about 10,000 cubic feet come. And for New Mexico, that's a lot, right? So we're gonna have that coming at the Pueblo. How do we do this? And as he said to me was, well, if Mother Nature wants to rain, we're gonna welcome that rain, and we just have to make sure the people are safe. And whatever happens to our village, it's just things. It can be repaired and it can be replaced. And so we worked with the Army Corps of Engineers, who wanted to build big structures and big concrete in our cultural landscape. And we were like, no, that's not gonna work. But we integrated the ideas of the grandpas and grandmas, the traditional leadership, Army Corps of Engineers. We did Flow 2D models. We worked with the hydrologists from the various federal agencies. And in the end, what we did was we worked within the landscape, looking at the features of the landscape, not to stop the flooding, not to control the flooding, not to say it's not going to go this way, but to have a multi-point system of protection, mitigation, but allowing for potential failure of those points in the system, in the whole watershed system. Enough time for the people to get out of the way safely if need be. And so, in fact, when September 2013 came, it was about 5 major points, and 2 of them failed, but it wasn't a catastrophic failure. It reduced the energy in the water, but and then just kept pushing the water to one direction. And in the end, it went into the river and around the village and protected the homes and the main village. But I see that as an interdisciplinary and a multi-level collaboration. And we also had a lot of education of the kids as well as the community, because we don't want them running out when it's flooding, even though it's like amazing to see when it floods after a fire. So, but we had the kids also understand, like if it gets to a certain level, and literally what I did was put T-posts in the watershed. And for the tribal officials, I labeled it green, yellow, red. I literally spray painted the T-posts. I said, okay, at this point, if it's here, then we're okay. If it's at yellow, we better start doing some movement here of the people. So it really was an educational experience and integrated so many different perspectives and inputs into that solution. So I just wanted to share that. Thanks.
That's great. It's an awesome story of everything from a federal agency down to kids, you know, being part of, I don't know if the solution is the right word, but really engaged and listening to each other. It's an awesome example, Phoebe. All right, Louise.
Yeah, what a great story. Thanks for sharing that. I was thinking about, so in 2010, we started leading a climate adaptation planning process for the Sky Island region that really involved a diversity of organizations, land and resource management agencies, scientists working in the region, and stepped folks through this process of starting really basic with what do we know about climate change in the region, what are our greatest vulnerabilities, and then what, you know, moving from there over a course of years with these big planning workshops to where do we want to focus efforts together, what sorts of actions can we take to respond to climate change. And one of the really important outcomes, just big picture of doing that kind of work. I mean, it was a heavy lift. It was a lot of work and it was a lot of time commitment for the folks that participated. But what's happened since then is all these different entities, you know, were part of that process and bought into these shared goals and the shared understanding of climate change and how we can respond. And they're doing their own projects, you know, based on that planning. And for us, one of the really important project outcomes was over the course of doing this planning, spring ecosystems popped out as this. I mean, we all know they're really important, but it popped out as, yeah, these are really important. They're probably going to be a lot more important as the climate warms, because some of them are pulling up very, you know, deep old water that will persist even as the climate dries. And we don't really know much as a community across the Sky Islands where there's water at springs, you know, there's points on maps, but nobody's been there to see what's the situation on the ground. And so as a community, we built this whole project with the county has been involved, the state wildlife agencies, land management agencies. We're working with ranchers in Mexico to go out to these springs, understand what water's there, what wildlife is using them, and start to take steps to protect really important springs on the landscape and restore springs that could be resilient when there's some sort of alteration, human alteration, or something that's preventing them from being available for wildlife and plants and that kind of thing. So just really, it was a huge success to see that project grow. And it's so wonderful that now all these different partners are working on this shared vision around springs in their own way. You know, the National Park Service has their own work and science around it, but the USGS does. But we're all coming together, continue to come together as a group and share information. And importantly, also understand the picture of what's going on at this whole big regions, which helps with understanding where are the most important places on the landscape. And if you're only working in your footprint of the Park Service or the Forest Service, you might not be seeing that bigger landscape picture, which is so important for climate adaptation.
Thanks, Louise. Those were all great. Those are great stories. Thank you, panelists. Those are awesome. We just have a shade over 10 minutes left. And I have a surprise question for you. So I was thinking about this. I was looking at the remaining questions. I was like, I feel like another question. So here's my question for you, and I will answer it myself. And I just thought of it. So, I'm on the hook as well, which is for our audience out there who are thinking about working on interdisciplinary teams or groups or entities, projects. What advice do you have for them? Either aspirational, practical, or both? And I'm feeling very practical today. I'm a very grounded, practical person. So my practical advice to lead off, and then I'll put, I'm gonna go back to Louise, since she was last, and then I'll put the order that I'd like people to speak into the chat function. And I'll remind you too. But my very practical advice is, if you're going to work on an interdisciplinary team, be very explicit about the communication and the organizing tools that you're going to use, right? Like, take a surprise, like the first time somebody really forced me to do that, I thought it was shockingly detailed and perhaps a waste of time, how much we spent thinking about different tools, but it was actually really, really helpful. Whatever that organizational tool is, from Trello to Asana to a pad of paper to a physical calendar, and thinking about how that group can best communicate, based on what people have done in the past and tools they're already familiar with, what you have access to, but really thinking through that communication and that organizing piece is super helpful. That's what I have. So I'm going to go to Louise, and then I will put the order in the chat box real quick.
Yeah, I hear that, Tamara, because not everybody can use Dropbox, believe it or not. I mean, in terms of federal agencies and all that. So I think in my experience, something that's been really important is building shared goals with the group, like not necessarily, I mean, you have your own goal as an organization or entity doing the work, but it's like you have to build from the ground up a little bit with interdisciplinary groups to get the buy-in and get people on the same page. And anyways, I never, people bring things to the table that I would never think of from where I'm coming from in my work. So I think it's harder work to start kind of in some ways from scratch with building the goals together. But I really think that kind of community building around what are we really going to work toward as a group is so important to keep people engaged and on the same page and moving toward those shared goals.
Thank you. I think I'm next. Is that right, Tama? So that's a hard question. Again, here in virtual land that we are in, because what I find a lot is the in-person, especially working with communities, is in-person interactions and connectivity, being able, in my culture, my Pueblos, we come into a room and we say "Goadzina," we acknowledge everybody in the room. And I've taught my kids, you go to everybody and you say "Goadzi," meaning hey, how you doing? And that's just the normal. And it's a sense of respect and acknowledgement of their presence. Even if they don't respond, you still, so given that though, right now, I'm very, whatever issue, whatever situation, whatever challenge we're working on, I always like to go and make sure that we all get grounded. Like, what are the basics? I mean, here as we work on climate adaptation or any associated issue, is we're all human. We need water to live. We're majority water. Can we just agree on the basics? But have everybody have their voice within that initial, and it takes time. But if we don't have that grounding, and I'm big on consensus building, getting everybody's input, because no matter what, even within our family landscapes, there's a hierarchy, right? The mother, the dad, the kids, the big brother, the big sister, all the way down. But if we have that level of respect that we all have a voice, we all have something to share and contribute, I think that's really important. It takes some extra time in the beginning, but it really is important as the process rolls out, because as in any project, whether you're doing an infrastructure project or whether you're working on a big challenge, there's always going to be divergent views. But we can respect that. We can respect that if we share it in a respectful way and, acknowledge it. We're all different. I'm looking at you and you can see what's behind me. I can't see what's behind me. So you're going to have a different perspective. So it's really that grounding and then that respect and that acknowledgement of what everybody can contribute to a issue or a solution. So that's my advice.
Thanks, Phoebe. The thought you need to go slow to go fast came to mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I like what Louise and Phoebe have said so far. So it's kind of shared goals, establish shared goals, and then ground the group in the work that's in front of them. And I think I would contribute to that, that there's time and space for each of the disciplines to explain and elaborate on, if you were facing this problem in your discipline, how would you approach it? And to bring that understanding and knowledge to the group. I think maybe sometimes in interdisciplinary groups that's rushed over too quickly. And so I think having the time and space up front to fully elaborate from the discipline specific perspective, how does your field think about this issue, this problem? How would they solve this issue, this problem? Because if you don't spend that time sharing, you're not going to find the overlap, and you're not going to get to the shared goals. You're not going to get maybe to the grounding and sense of respect that the whole group needs. So I think, I think that would be my contribution.
Thanks, Sherry.
I really like what everyone said so far, and it helps me because I can sort of check some of those off because you've taken what I was thinking. But I think a lot of people on the call may be coming from a scientific background, approaching this as scientists or trained as scientists, and I was too when I started doing climate adaptation work. I'm a research hydrologist by training, and my first piece of advice is that you have to be grounded in your science and then move beyond your science to listen to people in small groups of people. So that's my number one. My second piece is that when you're working on interdisciplinary teams, just as Phoebe said, respect is really key and critical. And that means respecting other people's science, other people's goals, perspectives, just that key element of respect for other perspectives. And then finally, when we started doing this, we thought of outreach as kind of a fire hose, like we want to share all of this information with you, and then learned over the last 8 years that actually the most important piece is listening, really listening to people's perspectives, to people's goals for their land, to a deeper listening. So those are my three pieces of advice: is just slow down and listen.
All right, so I guess I'm last, and since I'm last, I'll keep it short and sweet like me and say ditto. No, just kidding. But I think that's one of the pieces too, is having humor and humility in the work that we do, because I understand, when I got involved in dealing with climate change, adaptation, and resiliency, often what we hear and see is doom and gloom. But I think, when we really look at the different perspectives in which we come from as far as that interdisciplinary work, that the collaboration is very much needed, as well as coordination and communication. So, I'm a very big stickler on inclusivity when it comes to these different plannings or implementation, or just these different concepts that are really evolving around Pueblo and Indian country that, you know, it's always like, well, hey, don't forget about us. You know, we exist here in the state of New Mexico just as much as the Hispanic people do, just as much as the other non-native people do. So really having that ability to be inclusive in these discussions, in these conversations, in the planning, I think is really imperative. And I know oftentimes people aren't sure who to reach out to or where to reach out to. And much of it really is just a simple conversation. And I think the more we're able to have that ability to communicate, I think is the more we're able to find that even playing ground to build that foundation to work collaboratively in these spaces that we're creating to really address adaptation measures, building resilient communities that are cross-boundary, that do transcend in these different capacities. So for me, that would be my advice, is really just that inclusivity all around. Thank you.
All right, those were all fantastic. What an amazing group of panelists we have. Thank you so much. You know, and just to sum it all up, I think what everybody was talking about were both processes, like really thinking about your process, and also ways of being, you know, and how easy it is when we want to solve a problem, you know, and people are doers, to try and kind of rush past those, and how important it is to take a breath and take a step back and think about how we want to bring ourselves to the table, encourage others to bring themselves to the table, and the processes that we need to have to do that. So thank you all. I am just, once again, it was just a fantastic way to spend an hour. Thank you, thank you, thank you.